if you have kind of thoughts. Additionally, the place where feedback would be good is there's different styles with which to present the final kind of schema, whether it's down to how you want to see kind of spacing, how do you want to see types defined versus natively kind of embedding kind of classes. If you have strong feelings about kind of either of those, it'd be great to put them on the list.
Kathleen Moriarty. So from past experience, I would love to see if we can get a couple of volunteers who might go through and comb the UML versus the schema so that we reduce the errata that gets filed later. So maybe the chairs could try to get a couple of volunteers. Anyone? So would anyone here be willing to do that? So, and what just it entails just making sure everything matches up between, so I'm sorry, so we have how many? Oh, great. Good. So we have 3. Thank you. Because it's so easy to miss stuff, and we had a slew of them on the first one. It's just much easier if we can. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that would help in addition to the UML and the XML is that we've been trying to keep a change log going about what's different. I know we're not very good about that. I mean, I find things that we miss kind of all the time. So if in doing kind of that pass, if you could take a look at that, that would be greatly appreciated. Future implementers will thank you.
Can I ask an ignorant question about UML? I assume there are tools that can help too, or is it more than that? You're just making sure that XML matches the UML schema?
When we say UML, I mean, I think we have used UML Lite. So I'm not sure how much the tools will help us here. So I think Alexa was saying, how about some tools that will take the UML and compare it to the schema? And I was making the comment that we use UML Lite a little bit. I'm not sure how strict we were, and especially the way we represent it in the text. I actually don't know how we'd extract it. Someone has a piece of text that it can extract that ASCII art. I'm all ears. That'd be great, actually. That'd be really exciting, actually. All right, next slide. I just want to talk about some of these issues in depth now. So the mailing list has been really active in the last day or two on this particular issue. So we talked about this about a year and a half ago about the fact that the software type, the IETF software type, which is a way to just describe an application or a piece of kind of software, whether it's saying, hey, I got my data from this piece of software or this piece of software was targeted, we have this data type to explain that. We went back and forth about a year ago to about SWID, CPE was kind of mentioned. We said punt at that time. In Honolulu, we said we had a lot of different options. At this point, we really do have to decide. And so the 4 options, at least the 4 options, I think we have are use OVAL, use SWID, don't do anything, just say that's someone else is going to do that with additional data. Or the last approach is to support multiple techniques to include 1 and 2 and use something like the IETF SCI extension or the enum kind of draft just to put in an IANA registry things like 1 and 2 and potentially other things, and then have a blob to represent what that raw format would be. So we had a number of things said kind of on the mailing list. Are there other things to add to said conversation?
Do you have a feel for which option is preferred by?
The list looked like it was leaning towards 4. No one said anything positive about 1, 2, or 3. I mean, all the feedback it was 4.
Okay, I'll +1 that one, I think.
Yeah, +1. Dave Waltermeyer, +1 on 4 as well.
Because I think type of identifiers and registries might change over time, so you don't want to be, corner yourself by.
Yeah, so this is Sean Turner. So I think I kind of took the bait on this one, right? So for me, I look at it this way, like OFL is like kind of like some of the de facto standards, right? And it's used, there's thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe Kathleen correct me. It seemed really weird to force everybody to go to SWID, right? But when I first started looking at SWID, it was maybe a little confusing whether you had to pay to get a number. That would be bad for open source people. So that didn't seem to make, so at first that didn't seem to make sense. So if we pick SWID and we make everybody switch from OVAL, that seems weird, right? Then we could come up with a mapping scheme. Is that what we really want to do? I don't know. And then don't define it all seems like kind of not really doing anything. It seems like maybe supporting both seems like the way to go. And I don't think you really need to pick an MTI here. I think it's whatever, because the idea is, can you get a free identifier? And then is the database that you're going to go look at actually available? And they both are. So great, we're covered.
Kathleen Moriarty, contributor. So I also agree that that's a fine answer because, as Alexi said, it will change over time. Groups can choose what they want to use, and we don't spend a year arguing about this.
Yes.
And the last one's with the hat on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dave Waltermeyer again. I agree with everything that was said at the mic here. I like 4 because we can incorporate the other options into 4, and it provides the flexibility and extensibility that we'll likely need over time.
So I mean, again, I tend to support 4 is the right answer. So a bit of a pulling that thread a little bit. If you guys remember what we did with the enum draft, which is to say, yes, it's really hard to have enumerated references, but as it turns out, if we're going to create the IANA registry and create an XML format, that's probably useful across the IETF for folks that want an XML representation, and maybe others will even use the IANA registry as well. So talking kind of with SACM, and I'm looking at kind of Adam, is there kind of benefit to the working group to take this kind of thinking to implement option 4 for software type and to create a very, very short draft in the same vein as the enum draft for this as well, and this would be useful to SACM. What is SACM's perspective? Yeah.
Adam Montville. Yeah, it's useful for SACM. It will be, and there's just no question. So, yeah, if you need help with that, I'll help you with that.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we put that together?
How about you to co-edit this small draft?
Say again?
How about you to co-edit this small draft?
I didn't understand.
Co-edit this new small draft.
Right.
You and
we'll work on it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
we had already been kind of thinking that that would be the right answer, very much like the enum draft. I mean, kind of short and it's
Yeah,
useful.
sounds straightforward,
Just one, Dave Waltermeyer, one clarifying question. Are we talking about creating another IANA table for software, or are we talking about adding entries to the IANA table that has been created under the enum draft, as an example?
I was thinking different.
Sorry, Adam Montville again. I could see it going either way. So let's talk about it and make a decision and then move forward. Like today, we can talk about it after this
Yeah, that makes sense.
and go to the list and all that.
Yeah, absolutely, all of that. I mean, let's present the option pros and cons of making new and using something different.
John Field also agrees with number 4, enables open and forward compatibility.
Okay. So we're tipping 4. Is there anyone that wants to speak up about 1, 2, or 3, or present 5? All right. We'll call it 4. I mean, that's the consensus.
I
on
think
the
you have
mailing list.
directions on this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think 4 is the answer. So Adam and I will work to get a draft, a skeleton draft that will reference, that will create a separate extension for IODEF software type. Obviously, you have a different namespace, and then additionally, we'll bring to the list the conversation about, reuse the IANA registry, create a new IANA registry. Okay.
Can I ask one question? Regarding number 4, I guess the current mechanism like ANAM or IODEF site, both of them can be used as well. Why do you have to have a new draft? You said already you are going to talk about it at least, but why do we have to? And are there any reason to create a new draft on that? Because for the extensibility, we are using IANA table, both of the ANAM and also IODEF. Both of them are using IANA table for the extension. And this is a chance for us to use the extension, I thought. So I don't see the point to use to have a new draft on that. If you have a reason for that, I want to hear that.
So the way I would answer that is that, I think it goes back to the conversation of, do we need a new IANA table or not? Yeah. Because right now in IETF, SEI, and enum, each one of the different classes that are defined, the classes themselves aren't the problem, it's what IANA registry they're bound to. So if it turns out that we can reuse one of the IANA registries, then yeah, I mean, it would actually make sense to reference one of those other ones. I think if it turns out that that's not the case, then we should we may need kind of a new draft. I think then the question is, assuming we do all that, are then we comfortable with whatever is the name that's assigned to kind of all of those, whether it's in the SEI or in the draft.
Dave Altmeyer, from my understanding, though, regardless of whether we decide to create a new IANA table or use the existing ones, we're going to have to write a draft to instruct IANA to do some work. So a new draft will be required no matter what.
So is it true that because we have a specification required and also expert review, so if we have expert review, we can just change the IANA table, I guess. That's my understanding. Is that correct or not?
Is it expert review for SEI? I'm sorry, I
And
just don't
also for
remember.
INM as well, I guess.
Was it?
Yes.
Okay. I think we should take a look at the options then. Why don't we kind of stare at it again and kind of make sure that that's part of the conversation. So that'll be the prerequisite if we're going into the draft then.
So yeah, I mean, there is no reason to create a new draft and there is nothing
Absolutely.
new to add basically, but yeah.
That makes perfect
Okay.
sense.
So it looks like we're going with option 4, and then we need a little bit of discussion or some, if you want to discuss privately and then circulate on the mailing list your ideas, that would be good.
Makes sense? Okay. Moving on to the next issue. So this is about specifying related DNS, and we have these options on the mailing list as well. And so the thinking here is that we want, right now we have a series of classes, for lack of a better term, that would describe A records. So we can describe domain names and kind of IP addresses, but all the other things that we can do kind of with DNS are not described, all the different kind of record types. And so there was this desire to represent some of that information. And so there was a stub in the data model for related DNS. We have all of the XML isms of how you would represent those things. The problem that what we don't have is what is the actual representation of the different of the different DNS fields. And we kind of talked about it. I think we initially started, and it's actually not listed here, is that just use dig output as a blob and kind of put it in there. That honestly wasn't a good answer. And so we needed to think about it a little bit more. Also not on this list, I'm sorry, it actually is, it's option 2. It was include comma separated values. And at Honolulu, we talked a little bit more where Paul said, I have a JSON draft. Why don't we use the JSON draft? Then there was further discussion on the list about, hey, why don't we just punt on this the same way we would have punted on the last one and say it's additional data, it's someone else's problem. And then there was the possibility that no one has taken up work on is someone could actually XMLize the JSON draft or kind of come up with their own representation for all the different DNS types. So either way, I think we need to decide, I think, 2 things. We need to decide whether we still want to do this or we're going to kind of punt on this outright, or do we want to adopt one of these, I guess, that punt on it is honestly option 3. Do we want to implement 1, 2, or 4, or does anyone else have anything to add to the discussion? On the mailing list, the feedback to date there was not consensus. The one thing that folks said about the JSON draft, which is actually complete, is it's JSON, and so that's a little kludgy to bring in an XML with some of the feedback. Feelings or strong feelings?
Sorry about that, folks.
Those would be strong feelings.
Sean Turner, no strong feelings here. The only thing about referring to the other draft is trying to figure out what the status is. So
It's experimental right now, and that is one of the cons. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not loving that.
Well, Jason, working group just closed, and Paul Hoffman might have some cycles. I don't know whether you want to take this option.
I mean, the other thing with the JSON is there's blob and where we could define a transformation, because again, it's not that complicated.
So we're standards track and that's experimental?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, so, okay. And then the second thing is, does anybody actually think that number 4, hold on, defining related, does anybody not think that creating the XML for DNS is not the correct way? We just don't want to do the work?
I sense that it is a little bit of that.
I mean, there's a lot of head nodding. Is there anybody who thinks that's not the case?
Kathleen Moriarty, I'm in agreement, and I have been, in certs where, they show me what they're doing. I used to do this stuff, I don't anymore. And DNS is huge for them, right? They rely on lookups and sharing. data that you can't find anymore because the WHOIS information is gone and DNS lookups are gone, but they still need to show the history of attack profiles. So, you can't just leave in the DNS or an entry and then expect that the data is going to be transitioned around because it could be gone, right? So you need it in the incident data that goes with the exchange.
Yes, Chris. So Chris Nacio, so let's just define the. Yes, okay. I'll work on the defining DNS records in XML, and I'll foist it on you. Fair enough. We have a volunteer.
You preempted my question, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Any other comments on related DNS? I think we have this one resolved. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, yeah. So this is another one that's in the tracker, and the origin of this is crosswalking. I think actually in this case it was the NIST standard on incident reporting. One of the things that we wanted to capture is what is the cause of the incident. And so I think the question to put on the table is 5070 BIS doesn't do it. SCI does it through IODEF-SCI, kind of the weakness class. If the need is specifying the cause of an incident, is that weakness class from the SCI draft sufficient? Does anyone want to see something different? And so again, the weakness class, Taki is going to correct me here. That again is would be a pointer to an external registry that would be a dictionary of kind of weaknesses. I think other options would include trying to define our own dictionary. That's why I framed it that way.
Yeah, I think you made a very compelling argument for reusing other dictionaries is a good idea, if you can do that.
By the way, for this kind of pointer, I guess not only HCA, but also enum draft could be useful. Maybe that could be more useful for the enum draft actually for this. Enum draft is for the pointer to the identifier, and CWE has an identifier. So maybe CWE could be used better by enum draft rather than HCI, I guess.
Okay. Well, CWE through enum. Yeah. Other thoughts? So that's another option. Why don't we put it on the list and see whether there's any kind of feelings one way or kind of the other. But what I hear is no excitement to define our own dictionary, which I think is a very good idea. It's a question of what's the right way to point to someone else's dictionary. Okay.
Do you have a sort of proposal in your mind how this might look like, or is it still need a bit of thought?
I think it requires a little thought. I think Taki's right. We should, and part of this kind of comes down to what do we want to say in 5070 BIS, I think is the difficulty. Do we want to say, point back to IODEF SCI? That creates its own set of that's one kind of path. The other way to say it is not references at all, and someone just drops the SCI reference through additional data. And then I think the third option is to potentially drop something through the enum draft as a way. I think part of it comes down to if we acknowledge that talking about weaknesses is a thing that's of concern. Do we want to just say yes, SCI kind of handle it, if you want it, pull it in, or do we want to explicitly with 5070 BIS reference? We know that this is important. Go to this place to read about it. It's a little bit of kind of a design approach about how we fold in, honestly, all the great thinking that the SCI has that was missed in the draft.
Okay, suggestion. Can you create 3 examples of the 3 things you and post it to the mailing list and just let people, before you do more work than that?
Yeah.
Good.
That was about as much as I was going to do. Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I ask one question? I think you have a lot of insight, but on the other hand, as I end the discussion, the draft, this big draft would be really a large document, so that's not so easy to read. It is possible to split some content with the guidance draft, because guidance draft would be able to write some content of this, I guess.
So you think we have to write more text? That I'm misunderstanding?
Sorry, some contents this kind of consideration could go to the guidance draft as well, because
Oh, yeah.
guidance could be existing for that reason, I guess.
You're right. Maybe a fourth option to write up. Okay, I can do that. Further thoughts on that? Okay. So I just wanted to point out, something didn't make the slides, and this is my fault. I've gotten various feedback from folks that have looked at the text, and they gave different feedback. I put it on the mailing list, and so this morning, so it didn't make it to the slide. So I just wanted to kind of point it out, but you can read the details on the mailing list. First, one of the bits of feedback was, I have to share tens or hundreds of thousands of a particular indicator, think a big long text file of IP addresses. I'm not all that excited. The feedback was, they weren't all that excited to wrap each individual IP address with all the XML, and they said, wouldn't it be really great if we had one big tag that I could drop my big long list of IP addresses in? And so the thing I was sharing was honestly a lot more kind of simple. And so I think what I was saying is something on the order of bulk observables. So bulk observables kind of say what is there one per row of on the list, and we would support some subset of the observables we currently have, was one bit of feedback. The other bit of feedback was the counter right now only counts particular rates, actual measured rates. It would be really nice to also convey things like peak rates or average rates, and there actually might be kind of others if we're opening up that can of worms. So that was one bit of feedback. And then there was this notion of, right now we can describe the observed protocol, but the observed protocol number, like the TCP port, may not actually be associated with what's actually being using that port. So if I ran HTTP on 8371, there's a way to say I ran 8371 TCP, but there's no way to say that was HTTP. So is there some way to represent that with the 3 bits of feedback I got privately?
Sounds that maybe you should create a track items for them, and
I will. I will do exactly that.
Good.
Okay, so there's those things. That's all I have in terms of the formalism. I will say, the text needs work. More help on the text, please. Editorial things, please.
Well, the list of outstanding issues is much shorter this time than it was in whole, which is a good sign.
We're trying.
So I think we should strive to do a working group last call before Prague.
Agreed.
We can talk offline about, maybe we'll pick a date in early April to start the process. And do you have any changes outstanding? I'm trying to remember. Do you have an unpublished version of the draft that you would like to?
I do. There's a few editorial things I've already caught.
All right. Okay. Well,
we'll push that out.
Okay. We'll talk after the meeting.
Makes sense. Okay.
How are we doing this remote presentation there?
Yes. Do you know how?
Okay. Yes, earlier about.
Can we switch the agenda in this case?
Yeah,
I can try to
let's do implementation report on that. Somebody came up to me and asked, where the new Teco presentation is going to be. I said after this one, and anyway. Let's switch to the last topic first.
Good morning, this is Daisuke Miyamoto. So we will present my implementation report. So next slide, please. So today's agenda is roughly to an update of implementation guideline in section 7 and update on some implementations such as changes of the status of such kind of implementations. So next slide, please. Okay, this is the guidelines, and the 1, 3, 4, 5 is done in Rust IETFs, and so I RAP is .pm is today's topics, and then 8 is the update of status. So next slide, please. Okay, let's start update or during 3 months. So IETF Web is an open source module written in Python, and it parses and edit IETF documents. And the developer of this IETF Web is Philip, and it's designed for as simple as possible. So, sorry, maybe this is my misspell. PyB is a generator of Python code. It can be also generated in such modules from IETF XSD, but it generated module tend to be inherits complexity of XSD, so a little bit complex and a little bit uneasy to use. So therefore, they create a scratch and do personal edits and IETF and XML covers. So I described in this function in section 7.2. So next slide, please. It is also a famous module for treating an IETF and XML file. And IETF PM is an open source module written in Perl. And the developer is Wes Young from Ren Isaac, maybe. And person edit an IETF document as well as an IETF rep. And it also provides a simple heading preferences. And describes this section 7.3. Okay, next slide, please. So this is today's key topics and updates or implementations. For example, so on N6 SDK, I explained in Rust IETF in Honolulu, and this was other implementations. But according to third postcard, the developer of N6 SDK, they published it as open source, so we changed the portion from another implementation to open source implementations. And of course, we also envision the update that is community support software. For example, in APWG, at this moment when maybe this section was drafted in APWG, the plan to support. Currently, they support these tools for reporting e-crime. So their e-crime reporting tool, named as eCrisp, maybe, is available, and they started to use an IODF for maybe in APWG, due to the nature of APWG, this is phishing. So they started reporting formatting IODF. Thank you, and Jesse Moriarty. And he introduced me to Mieke. Thank you very much. Nerike, thank you very much. And maybe I will get the informations from an APWG. And of course, we will share this kind of information to other stakeholders, such as panels, is a guideline draft. This section is also necessary for and also Ren Isaac is a research and education network, and Isaac means that maybe an information sharing and analysis center or consortiums. And they also supported Reno IODF tools. This is also worth to list up as the community software. So in such case of a community support software, maybe I need help to gather informations, and it is very helpful to inform at mailing list. Thank you very much. This is just all my today's topics. Yeah, this is the summary, sorry. And what I did in the base draft is Dr. Moriarty's, and updating IDF 90 and 91s, and the envision update is like this.
I'm not set up. Are you set up? Oh.
Hi, Sean Turner. Great, this is awesome. I love having this kind of stuff because people can know where to go and go get stuff. The only thing I would caution you about is trying to never close the document, waiting for everyone to give you input. At some point, you have to say, we got 12 of these or 6. Let's move on and publish what we have. If they want to update the implementation report later, we can do that.
Probably, who doesn't know that he's. We're getting ready for the remote presentation, and I think we can hear you. Either this or somebody is rolling his house, and So I think he will. Okay. So you want this? Yeah. You have a connector?
Would it be better if I just quickly went down slides and page through those and he's on.
John, can you hear me? You can unmute yourself now.
Hi guys, John here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. So I've not done this particular remote meeting tool before, so I'm not 100% sure. Will you guys control the slides or do I do that?
We will control the slides, yes.
Okay, so I'll just ask for next slide at the appropriate time. Okay, so I guess I'm up. Should we get started right now?
Yes, keep going.
Okay, all right, thank you guys. So here today to talk about the ROLI draft, resource-oriented lightweight indicator exchange. I have approximately 10 slides and approximately 10 minutes, so we'll go through pretty quickly. I think probably the best approach is to kind of run through the content. It's simply a quick overview and introduction for members of the team, members of the group who perhaps have not looked at the draft. It's been out there for a while, and really this is just kind of to bring it to the fore. So next slide, please. Okay, so
we'll upload the slides.
Yeah, you guys can click forward. We're going to talk about what is the ROLI draft and at a very high level what motivated it. So the idea here is that a while back I had the opportunity to work on a POC implementation where essentially setting up a proof of concept consortium to exchange information using IODEF and RID. The learnings that came out of that experience kind of led to the ROLI draft. It was really an opportunity to have another way to do things intended to supplement or to complement what we already have, and I think fills a need that we may not currently be addressing. Next slide, please. Okay, so in short, ROLI is a RESTful approach to sharing cybersecurity information. And the idea is, in a nutshell, a very simple way to interpret this is that I created what is essentially an atom feed binding for IODEF and RID. And the concept was to enable people to do a looser coupling so that information could be exchanged more dynamically, and to do that in a way that was asymmetric in the adoption. We'll talk a little bit about that as I go forward. But I think one of the concepts in the current interchange capabilities is that it is a peer-to-peer message-based approach rather than something that is more asymmetric and perhaps more RESTful, in that we can do things more dynamically without as much infrastructure as a precondition. Next slide. Okay, a little bit of a delay on the slides. That's why there's a pause here. Okay, so the high-level goals. High-level goals of the draft were to make it easier to do simple sharing. The notion that anyone with a feed reader can participate, anyone with an HTTP client can publish. The idea was that it would reduce the need for operational coordination between the parties that are doing the sharing. The notion also was to leverage existing identity management investments. So obviously a lot of investment has gone in over the last number of years in building out identity management infrastructure, everything from SAML to OAuth 2 and everything in between. I think we have something of a disconnect in that the authentication and authorization of existing message-based interactions has the notion of identity of the parties rather than identity of the individuals that are representing those parties. I think that's something that perhaps is a gap that we could close. Another idea here is that we can avoid heavier requirements for distributed policy enforcement. The notion that once a message is exchanged, that we're relying on distributed policy enforcement. Imagine an IODEF or a RID message that has been sent in response to a query. Enforcement mechanisms have to occur and will occur at the destination. The approach in ROLI was to emphasize enforcement at the source, essentially resulting in a looser coupling between the parties. Also a lack of a requirement, avoid a requirement for a lot of state management on the side of the provider, improving the scalability of the provider. Really nothing that's new here. This is really an attempt to adopt the approach taken by essentially the rest of the web, which is that you want to be as stateless as possible in your interactions. And again, we're talking about transport-related state, maintaining session state information at the transport layer for interactions between the peers. We want to minimize that overhead state management. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've probably spoken ahead of my slides. I do that a lot. That's okay. It saves us time on the slides. Basically, when I did this in the POC implementation that I had the chance to work on, I realized that there was a non-trivial investment needed to participate regardless of the specific role that the party was going to be fulfilling. If you're playing the role of purely a consumer and not a publisher, you needed to build much of the same infrastructure that a publisher would build. Using an approach as described in ROLI would allow for a more asymmetric deployment. There is nothing wrong with having symmetry except that it makes it a little bit harder to get on board. From the point of view of the larger community, when we think about sharing at very large scale, the goal was that for many use cases and for many participant roles, being able to do an identity-based authorization and participating via a RESTful feed would be sufficient and appropriate for those use cases. It doesn't exclude other uses, it's more supplementing and enabling participation for those that don't have all of the infrastructure necessary for the distributed state management. Next slide, please. Okay, so some use case examples that I'll just go through these real quick. This is kind of the nuts and bolts, try to ground some of what I've said in realistic, tangible use cases. Imagine a case where there's a RID query. The burden to actually do the compute task in really responding to the query falls on the provider. It falls on the server who's serving that response. Whereas what I think we see in other examples of a big data crunching problem is that we put the burden of consuming the feed on the client. So it kind of reverses things in a sense that if I want a specific, let's say, complicated query, could be any number of elements in the predicate, that the task of actually sorting through that could fall to the client rather than to the server. It's simply another option to have. In the case of a RID report, The use case that we stumbled into when we were doing the POC work was that doing the distributed transactional integrity made things a little bit challenging in terms of maintaining state on the server. With a more RESTful style, the server typically does not maintain application state, and as a result, it improves scalability. Next slide, please. Yeah, and in many cases here, by the way, that we talk about in the Rolly draft that the payload can be either RID containing IODEF or IODEF alone. Either one of those would be supportable. Some business use cases. The idea here is to support broad sharing. So imagine a government agency sharing indicator repository broadly with citizens in the private sector. The notion of a internet accessible repository that followed something like the Rolly draft would enable people to explore and discover in that repository and effectively obtain what was needed with less investment on the client side. Second use case, the private sector organization publishing intelligence feed to a subscribing customer. I think that's a use case that's well handled today, but would not be excluded by Rolly. It would simply be also supported. Private sector organization accepting incident reports from partners and customers. Again, I like this one because it enables broad participation. The ability to be able to do an HTTP post is all that's required. You don't need to have a full infrastructure of state management on the client side. Next slide, please. So a little bit on the relationship to existing RFCs. As I said, this is complementary to the existing RFCs. The idea is to leverage media type, which is commonly done in RESTful implementations. We make use of that HTTP media type header. Any other representations besides Atom and XML are possible, but that's what I chose to do in that first 00 draft. The use of existing HTTP return codes would, I think, be sufficient to enable clients to interoperate between the existing endpoint and any new endpoints that were introduced. Next slide, please. So a summary, wrapping up, basically the notion is that I personally kind of view the cybersecurity challenge as an asymmetric conflict. Attributes that I attribute to an attacker, generally loosely coupled collaboration patterns with a high degree of technical agility, really looking at an environment with continuous evolution and adaptability of the tactics and methods. My approach to this, I concluded that the message-based architectures function optimally when deployed and operated in a symmetric fashion, and I was looking to complement that with an asymmetric approach that would hopefully enable the economics and the scalability that are needed in order to enable sharing between people who couldn't participate today. Loose coupling and a uniform interface and use of content type negotiation is a well-proven pattern when we look at other systems that have adopted a RESTful style. I think that's it. I think our next slide is just for discussion. So I'm happy to take any questions that anyone can have.
Bob Moskowitz. Got this guy by the name of Mal, and he'd be sitting out there and he'd be interested in seeing how many things he can post to you to fill up your database. Or maybe he would say, well, can I do this query to totally tie up your server for generating the response to me so that nobody else can find out what's happening. The asymmetric, as you say, that's attack vector, can be used in attacking against what you proposed here. How would you address that and mitigate those operations?
Okay, good question. I assume I don't have to repeat the question. I think the short answer, one thing I kind of skipped over in the presentation was the assumption that we would leverage existing identity management infrastructures. Existing situations today, as I said, using things like a SAML assertion to authenticate yourself, or in the case of an interactive end user, something like an OAuth 2 authentication token. The idea is that the endpoint is still protected, right? Unless you can have multiple levels of access, and of course some information might be completely public, other information is not public and requires privileged access. I would assume that the end user, the client who is going to make that access, whether it's a post or a GET, is still going to be subjected to standard authentication and authorization techniques.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions?
Kathleen Moriarty. So this is, I guess, with no hat on for this, just an observation when I walked around a floor last year with products. REST was the most commonly used interface. People weren't using Rolly, may not be aware of it, but this interface is used very commonly on internal networks to do these exchanges, and it seems to be the one that's taking off the most that I could observe.
Thank you, Kathleen. That's good to know. I enjoy the data point from the real world. I think the issue is that this is a real opportunity that basically people are generally using lightweight HTTP RESTful approach. And of course, I think that immediately implies a need to standardize it in order to achieve interoperability.
And I'll just clarify too, I didn't do a study. I just walked around a particular conference. So whatever vendors showed up there, that was the majority.
Sometimes the best kind of study is walking around.
Hi, this is Sean Turner. It's just kind of a general comment. I went to NANOG in February, and like 6 of the 24 presentations were about DDoS, and some of the complaints were this stuff is too hard to use. The existing things are really too hard to use, so anything that makes it easier for the operators to actually be able to report this thing up is really good, and I think that they kind of get how to do RESTful things, and people kind of understand how to do that, so this, I think, is a really great idea.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I mean, to add to that comment, the idea that the RESTful approach can get you started. Perhaps think of it like the big toe in the water, or whatever analogy you want to use, whatever metaphor. It enables you to begin participating in the sharing and build up over time. It's very likely, at least I thought, in my experience in the POC, it was very likely that some people, some organizations participating in a sharing network, in a consortium, start out by being read-only and then eventually kind of move up the food chain and become full-fledged members. So again, another opportunity to leverage the investment we've already got in the existing representation formats and be able to use those in a wide variety of use cases that we perhaps wouldn't address otherwise. Okay, so I don't know if you guys have seen this, but my screen just went on standby. Hopefully that hasn't caused a problem.
We can still see.
Okay, very good. Okay, any other comments, questions?
Well, thank you for your presentation. We'll try to push on your to progress your document after we're done the 50-70 bits. But in the meantime, if you have any updates, make them, and also try to get application area review of the way you use REST.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm not sure I can find people, but I'll try.
Okay, one last comment is that this is obviously a 10-minute segment, so it's hard to cover all of the use cases. I'd encourage people to take a look at the first couple of sections of the draft. I do, in the draft, try to lay out some of the rationale. I tend to do that. Many years doing architecture work, I feel compelled to lay out the rationale as to how we got to this point. So I'd appreciate feedback on those sections in particular. Obviously, the technical nitty-gritty of the details of the binding is open for discussion, and we'd probably have many more discussions over that. I think really the motivation and the rationale is probably the appropriate focus for now.
Okay, so this is the end of our agenda. Any other business, any other questions, announcement related to MILE? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for coming, and you have, I'm not sure how much time. Yes, you have an hour and 8 minutes before your lunch. Enjoy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I mean, like, we have time at the same time. Okay. Yes. Right, so there are two questions. When do we do working groups? Nobody has to travel. Drop those off.